to recover the jolt of
Jesus' parables, we have to listen. Can you hear me? I just want to, no, right. We're going to just talk a little bit and make sure that our sound system is in working order. As you can begin to hear me, if you could raise your hands up, that would be great. Okay, well, we have some who can hear, others who are beginning to be able to hear, some others. All right, so I'm going to begin now. If it becomes
difficult to hear, by all means, raise your hands and we will take a pause. How's that? All right. Now, this was a very powerful parable, so I really want you to hear some thoughts about it. And in order to recover the jolt of Jesus' parables, I think that we have to listen to them with first century Jewish ears, taking into context the events described in the parables, the events happening in the community. And so we read that two people are going to the temple to pray, one of whom is a Pharisee. Now that's not unusual. But the other one is a tax collector, and that is unusual. If we want this parable to challenge us today, we need to frame our hearing of this teaching, understanding that for first century Jews, the very idea that a tax collector would receive approval over a Pharisee is shocking. Jesus' listeners would not expect the tax collector to go to the temple at all, let alone be justified. And we also need to take into account our 21st century thinking, our bias against the Pharisee, our Christian bias against the Pharisee, and that's understandable. Listen to Luke's depiction of them. They accuse Jesus of blasphemy after he heals a paralytic and forgives his sins. Later we hear the Pharisees grumbling at Jesus' association with tax collectors and sinners. And then following another healing by Jesus, they are filled with fury as they discuss amongst themselves what they might do to Jesus. And later in Luke's gospel details 3 banquet scenes where the Pharisees are hosting Jesus. But at each of these dinners, Jesus criticizes the host's behavior as exclusivist, elitist, and hypocritical, invoking similar versions of this indictment in Luke. Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. Now all of what I just told you occurs in Luke's gospel before we even get to today's parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. And I want us to keep in mind that by the time Luke's gospel was written, decades after Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended, at the time that Luke's gospel was written, Pharisees had come to represent Jews who refused to follow Jesus, refused to recognize him as the Messiah. The negative portrayal of the Pharisees in the Gospels, we need to remember, has been used by Christians throughout history as a resource for anti-Semitism, and it's something that we need to leave behind once and for all. And I think, secondly, it's important that we not deflect the words of Jesus away from ourselves onto someone else. So if we hear this parable through first century Jewish ears, the ears that would have been listening to Jesus himself, a much different
picture develops. The Pharisaic way of life was practiced by a relatively modest group of men and women. It had no political power. It was favored by the people because it took Jewish tradition and the Torah seriously, and it tried to interpret and live them in ways that touched daily life. The Pharisees taught the people to regard the gathering around the household dinner table as a community of worship. The handling of food and dishes were religious activities. They were serious about their faith. They fasted twice a week. They gave 1/10 of their income to the synagogue. The Pharisees were the good citizens in the community. Now, a lot of interpreters of this parable make a mistake of assuming that the Pharisee in the parable is representative of all Pharisees, that it was a religious movement founded on works alone that would include a high dose of judgment upon others. But listening in Jesus' day, one would have expected the Pharisee to be a careful observer of the law, in keeping with their generally high view of the Pharisaic movement that communities held in those days. It would be of no surprise to find a Pharisee in the temple, of course. But they would not expect the tax collector to go to the temple at all. The tax collectors of first century Palestine were generally corrupt. They paid a fee to the Romans to collect taxes in certain geographic areas, and in turn, they would exact whatever money they wanted from the people, and it was usually quite steep. Tax collectors, they muscled and intimidated people for money. Tax collectors actually helped pay for the Roman army's occupation of Israel. Consequently, they didn't have any friends where they lived and where they worked. And if you had an opportunity to vote into public office, either a Pharisee or a tax collector, you would have voted for the Pharisee. Today's parable serves up two behaviors that are out of character. That the Pharisee prays in a self-righteous manner, and that the tax collector prays at all. The contrast between the two prayers is impossible for us to miss. The Pharisee begins, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, even like this tax collector." But before we judge the Pharisee too quickly, I think we have to think about this prayer and reframe it slightly to wonder if we have ever uttered it ourselves. Maybe we haven't said, "Lord, I thank you that I am not like other people." But what about on seeing someone down on his luck? "There, but for the grace of God, go I." How many times have we said that? It isn't that the Pharisee is speaking falsely, but rather that the Pharisee misses the true nature of his blessing. As Luke states in his introductory sentence, he has trusted in himself. His prayer of gratitude may be spoken to God, but it is really about himself. He locates his righteousness entirely in his own actions and being. So we have to ask ourselves, how do our prayers, like the Pharisee's prayer, keep the focus on ourselves? His list of virtues divides the community rather than unifying it. The Pharisee not only uses the law to describe what he should do, fast, pray, give a portion of his income away, he also uses it to define who he is and who others are as well. The Pharisee perpetuates the us and them split that we often use in thinking about other people. Now, the tax collector on the other side of the temple stands on the margins, beating his breast. His words are simple. He doesn't embark on an eloquent litany of his sins to match the Pharisees' virtues. He hopes in God alone and not in the extravagant outpouring of remorse. Similar to other powerless outsiders depicted in Luke's gospel, the widow, the poor, the stranger, the tax collector casts himself upon the mercies of God. He knows his need. He knows his failing. He knows his weakness. He knows his absolute dependence upon God for all good things, including the gift of mercy. So he asks for just that, mercy. He doesn't pledge to amend his ways. He doesn't vow to leave his profession. He doesn't, in any strict sense of the word, repent. He just asks for mercy. He knows full well his human failings and absolute need and is aware of his dependence upon God's mercy and God's grace. And here is the essential contrast. One makes a claim to righteousness based on his own accomplishments, while the other relies entirely upon the mercy of God. And anytime you draw a line between who's in and who's out, this parable asserts you will find God on the other side. By forcing his listeners to see something positive about the tax collector, Jesus insists to us that even those who work for the enemy may still be a part of the congregation. In the end, it seems the only thing that separates these two. One doesn't need God, and so while righteous according to his own use of the law, he is not justified, meaning that he is not in right relationship with God. While the other knows his need, asks for mercy, and is justified by God. God's grace is not simply the infinite supply of divine forgiveness poured out endlessly upon hopeful sinners. Grace is also the mysterious strength God lends human beings who commit themselves to the work of transformation. So Jesus teaches us a lesson about God's merciful grace in justifying the tax collector. And if we come before God in humble openness and fervent trust in God's goodness, we then can make room for God to work in our lives. That is much closer to righteousness than all the good works that we can manage. We are saved by pure grace, and we must never, never live in such a way that grace is not needed hour by hour by